And Cher is probably louder than I was. Yeah, that's fine. So, and I'm just going to tell it as a narrative so that you can understand sort of, it gives some sort of narrative context to some of the excellent data, because really that's what we do. It started in 2006 when I covered what was a protest in Lower Park Heights about alleged serial killer. And the community turned out, about 100 people. And there was a tremendous amount of fear that there was a man in the neighborhood preying upon women. So I wrote a couple stories for the Baltimore Examiner about this protest, and it became quite controversial because the idea was there was no evidence at that point that there was actually a serial killer. You know, the numbers that we have from the police and the alleged victim they wrote up as a drug addict, and so it became quite controversial. You know, it became like the equivalent of Jason, what's his name? So it was not popular at that point. But it was an interesting story because for me, I didn't look at it as anything other than demonstrate how murky and how difficult it is to understand this problem and understand this type of violence. It's not always crystal clear. You know, the cases themselves are not always cut and dry, and the evidence, et cetera. So a couple of years later, during that period of time, I started investigating for the Baltimore Examiner, you know, what happens with all these murders? What happens with all these bodies? It's very different. We have two huge categories in the city. We have undetermined deaths, and we have homicides. And undetermined deaths are unclassified deaths. And then you have homicides, which of course, where there's more direct evidence. Of course, the undetermined deaths mean they're just, the medical examiner can't determine the manner of death. So there are a lot of people that fall into that category. And then you have the homicides, we investigated that. And only 25% of a homicide in this period of time, over a 10-year period, results in a jail sentence. And it's really interesting because I just interviewed a reporter for the Scripps Howard News Service who said that there were 200,000 unsolved murders in the U.S. from 1980. So there's a big, big category of gray area. So we get to 2008, which is when Nicole Sesker body was found over on Garrison Boulevard, who was the stepdaughter of our former police commissioner. And her death sort of triggered another investigation where we found 3 or 4 other women had been strangled in that period of time, who also had connection to sex trade and prostitution. And this caused quite a bit of concern and fear. And then during that period of time, another woman ended up dying, or ended up being murdered and strangled. So you had 5 women in a period of probably 4 or 5 months. So we did a broader investigation and found there were 29 cases of women who had some connection to the street and who had been murdered, and only 9 of those cases had been solved. So there was this huge category of gray area that we sort of came across, and it was kind of stunning. And during that period of time, they arrested a man named William Brown, who had been a man who was a bus driver, a petty drug dealer, a man known around that neighborhood, but he ended up being charged with murders that occurred in 2003. And it turns out that the police and the DNA had been sitting around for like 5 years. So during that period of time, who knows what happened. But he was never tied to the cases in 2008. He was simply tied to the cases in 2003. So it was just very demonstrative to me as a reporter that it's really very difficult to ascertain what's really going on in this situation. The only thing I learned is that women who are in this situation, and women who survive on the streets, are incredibly vulnerable, and they're easy targets. When I did some investigation of William Brown, he constantly was interacting with women in places like Wilkins Avenue. He was constantly picking up people, and he was constantly out there. Now, they only found 3 victims, but it seems possible, that there could be more, but we might never know. And meanwhile, we would always find undetermined cases that were, gray area. A woman found out in the woods 4 months after she died. There was the Tyrone Clary, who was the case who everyone said was a drug addict. Well, the medical examiner said she might have been asphyxiated. And, the media, we reported it as a drug overdose, but the medical examiner said it's not clear. So I think, investigating as a reporter, I think you find that not only are there a tremendous amount of gray areas when it comes to these kind of cases, but these women are targets. So fast forward to today. Most recently, I did a story on serial killers, and this investigative reporter took this database of unsolved murders and he did analysis. Well, he found almost 10 pattern killings and dozens of other pattern killings all across the country of people who could be serial killers that have not been caught. And 10 of them, 2 of them led to new investigations. But 70% of the victims are women. 70%. So I think we have an unclear picture, which is why this kind of data is excellent. Because, as someone who's been out there and talked to these women and reported on this, I can say that it's incredibly unclear, except for one thing, that these women are very easy targets. And they end up being targeted. For the very reason that their murders a lot of times are either politically controversial, for whatever reason, because they add a crime stat, or, they're just harder to solve. Or you had a person like William Brown who really operated with impunity to a certain extent for years. But that's not unusual. So I think just the lesson is that, it is a very, very difficult and I think a very, very difficult story to tell. It's a painful story. But on the other hand, too, there is no doubt in my mind as a reporter, the facts are pretty clear that women in these situations are simply easy targets and are often targeted. So that's my little... Okay. Thank you.